Have you ever felt like people don't always say what they really mean or mean what they say? Like there's always something just beneath the surface, something you can't quite explain, but you can definitely feel. Maybe it's the way someone suddenly changes their tone or how they act differently depending on who's around. And deep down, you start to wonder what's actually going on here. Because the truth is, most of what shapes human behavior isn't obvious. It's subtle, it's unspoken, and most books barely scratch the surface. So let's break this down. 1. People care more about how they feel than what's true. At first, it might seem like people value honesty above everything. We like to believe that truth matters, that if something is right, logical, or proven, people will accept it. But in real life, that's not always how things play out. Think about how often someone rejects a perfectly reasonable idea, not because it's wrong, but because it feels uncomfortable. Maybe it challenges their identity, their beliefs, or simply their sense of control. And instead of engaging with the truth, they instinctively push it away. The reason is simple. Emotions often override logic. People don't just process information, they protect how they feel. And once you understand that, you stop expecting pure rationality from others and start seeing behavior for what it really is. 2. Most people are constantly managing how they're perceived. You might assume that people are just being themselves most of the time, but in reality, many people are quietly adjusting how they act depending on who's watching. Notice how someone can be confident in one group, but reserved in another, or how their opinions subtly shift based on the room they're in. It's not always fake, it's often automatic, a kind of social calibration happening in real time. But here's the interesting part. People aren't just trying to be liked. They're trying to be accepted without risk. That means avoiding judgment, avoiding conflict, and maintaining a version of themselves that feels safe in that moment. And once you see this pattern, you realize authenticity is often more complex than it looks. 3. Silence often says more than words. We're taught to listen to what people say, but in many situations, what they don't say is even more revealing. Think about moments when someone avoids answering a direct question, changes the subject, or gives a vague response. On the surface, it might seem harmless, but underneath, there's usually something being withheld: uncertainty, discomfort, or even disagreement. And this is where it gets interesting. Silence isn't always about lacking something to say. Sometimes it's a deliberate choice, a way to maintain control, avoid exposure, or keep options open. Once you start paying attention to silence, conversations begin to feel very different. 4. People reveal their true priorities through small actions. Everyone has intentions. People talk about what they value, what they care about, and what matters most to them. But if you really want to understand someone, you don't listen to their words. You watch their patterns. It shows up in the little things. How quickly they respond when something matters. Where they consistently put their time and energy. What they follow through on, and what they quietly let fade away. Most people don't realize this, but priorities are rarely hidden. They're just not announced. They reveal themselves over time, through repetition. And once you start observing actions instead of promises, you gain a much clearer picture of who someone really is. 5. People are more influenced than they realize. We like to think we make independent decisions, that our opinions are our own, shaped by logic and personal experience. But in reality, subtle influences are everywhere. It could be the tone of a conversation, the confidence of the person speaking, or even the general mood of a group. These small factors quietly shape how people think, often without them noticing. And here's where it gets deeper. Influence doesn't have to be obvious to be powerful. In fact, the most effective influence is often the kind that feels natural, like it was your own idea all along. Understanding this doesn't make you cynical. It just makes you more aware of how human thinking actually works. 6. People avoid what exposes them. At first, avoidance can look like disinterest. Someone doesn't respond, delays something important, or changes direction entirely. It's easy to assume they just don't care. But often, it's not about laziness or a lack of interest. It's about discomfort. People tend to avoid situations that might expose their weaknesses, insecurities, or uncertainty. And this is where most people get it wrong. They interpret avoidance at face value, instead of looking at what might be underneath it. But when you start seeing avoidance as a signal, not just a behavior, you begin to understand people on a much deeper level. 7. The way people treat you often reflects their internal state. It's easy to take things personally. When someone is distant, dismissive, or inconsistent, the immediate reaction is to wonder what you did wrong. But more often than not, people's behavior says more about them than it does about you. Their stress, their past experiences, their current emotional state, it all shapes how they interact with others. This doesn't mean you ignore how people treat you, but it does change how you interpret it. Instead of reacting instantly, you start observing. And in that space, you've gained something powerful: clarity without unnecessary emotional weight. When you start noticing these patterns, something shifts. People stop feeling confusing and start feeling predictable in a different way. Not because they're simple, but because you begin to see the layers most people overlook. And the more you understand how people think, the more control you have over how you respond, how you connect, and how you move through social situations. If this made you see people a little differently, there's a lot more beneath the surface worth exploring. So if you're into understanding human behavior on a deeper level, stick around, because this is just the beginning.